Just to start, curious, how many of you here in the audience are government employees or contractors? Okay. How many of you have worked on any sort of game program? All right, well, that is a nice Venn intersection. I think we're going to have a good time. I have been instructed to give you a few logistical notes, the most important of which is the location of the coffee. The coffee, as many of you have already discovered, is upstairs, and that tap will be flowing all day, or there will be issues. Lunch will be both upstairs and downstairs. Bathrooms are downstairs, also on the 3rd floor. And is there anyone who did not get the little, very easy to lose slip of paper with the Wi-Fi access information? Okay, so Wi-Fi access, it's the GW_event network. The username is Jack Morton with no spaces. And the password is guest. So that's the Wi-Fi information. The breakout rooms are on the 3rd floor. So that's where we're going to be meeting and convening this afternoon for the breakout rooms. You guys have already probably seen the agenda. It's a really exciting agenda. There are a lot of parallel sessions that you're going to want to attend more than one of. And we have a great program that we've pulled together. We're trying to sort of bridge between the government and all of the problem sets that folks in the government are interested in, and this whole realm of games and game design, and what's the state of play in that industry, and what are the creative and technological opportunities afforded by where that industry has gone over the last few years. So to kick off the morning, I would like to welcome Farah Pandith, who's the State Department Special Representative to Muslim communities, and she's going to say a few words before we launch full throttle into the commercial gaming perspective.
Well, good morning. I am going to just move this so I don't get water all over the place. All right. It's a pleasure to be here, bright and early, 8 o'clock. It's very calm in here. Come on, let's get some energy in here. My name is Farah Pandith, and I'm the Special Representative to Muslim communities. I'm honored to open the 5th Tech at State, entitled Serious Games. The Tech at State program is one of the shining stars of innovation at the State Department. Through Secretary Clinton's 21st Century Statecraft Initiative, Tech at State convenes technologists, established leaders, government personnel, academics, entrepreneurs, and others. Tech at State seeks to spur collaboration on technology solutions to further goals of the U.S. diplomacy and development agenda. It thrills me to see my colleagues at State partnering with people outside of Foggy Bottom and outside of the Beltway. We realize that we must reach out to new people and sectors and make diplomacy more efficient and effective. As you know, today is all about games. So let's talk about the numbers. 65% of US households play video games. 2 out of 5 gamers are female. Nearly 5 billion people on the planet own a mobile phone, and between 2010 and 2015, 2.5 billion people will buy a smartphone. Of those people with2/3 say they have downloaded a gaming or social networking app. This isn't just happening in America. Technology and gaming is touching people, as you know, in every corner of the globe. The Middle Eastern gaming industry is worth between $1 billion and $2.6 billion. In October of '09, Farmville added India's flag to their web game after over 20,000 people petitioned the game's parent company. Given the power of technology and gaming, there are ways that games can play a role in international affairs. They can. How can we harness the creativity of the virtual world to generate answers to complex foreign policy challenges and human problems? Although games and foreign policy may seem like strange bedfellows, they are, in fact, quite complementary. And anyone who has played the game Risk knows this. Foreign policy relies on some of the same drivers that make successful games: collaboration, creativity in terms of the use of resources, judgment, envisioning outcomes, reaping rewards, reasoning, and let's not forget, courage. The issues my colleagues and I face every day are serious, complex, nuanced, and require innovative solutions. And at times, we need to look for solutions in unlikely places. This is where you come in. You are an important part of the toolbox. We must use our collective intelligence. We must harness the power of technology and gaming to envision solutions for our most vexing international challenges. Gamers and games reward people for coming up with creative solutions to problems, for overcoming obstacles, and for being persistent. What games do best is to help people imagine the unimaginable. They help us do things that we think we can't do in the real world. Games show us that we can solve complex problems and demonstrate that two unlikely partners can come together to reach a goal. They also eradicate borders and distance and age and race and gender. Gaming has proven to maximize the potential of technology. And there is so much innovation emerging from the gaming industries that it finds its way into the real world. For example, you all know this, flight simulators that you have played as kids and some of you as adults are now being used as learning and combat tools for the US military pilots. First-person video games have translated into augmented reality apps on smartphones that identify and label your surroundings. Now, our challenge is to use the same innovation that has fueled advances in combat environment, social networking, and academia, and bring it into the realm of diplomacy and problem solving. They teach us new things, help us communicate in new ways, allow us to better understand ourselves and others, and motivate us to act to achieve a specific goal. Gaming is a powerful tool in our diplomatic toolbox. And we are here today to explore how we can do much more with this tool. Now, you might be wondering why they asked the special representative to Muslim communities to open Tech at State today. What does my job have to do with technology and gaming? The answer is Generation Y and Generation V, digital natives. My focus is on Muslim youth globally. President Obama has made engagement a top priority in this administration. He talked in Cairo about the need to build partnerships based on mutual interest and mutual respect. All parts of our government are doing this. And at the State Department, many different offices are building new relationships and increasing dialogue. Secretary Clinton asked me to focus on people-to-people engagement, and I do this in partnership with our embassies all around the world. Now, there are 1.6 billion Muslims on the planet. That is 1/4 of humanity. The demographics tell the true story. 62% of 1/4 of humanity is under the age of 30. This is a youth quake whose effects you are going to see as they harness, and you see it now in real time, as they harness technology around them to affect real change in their lives. This is a demographic that is active and connected. And I call them Generation Change. We need to listen and partner with them, and we're doing just that. Young people are my constituency, which means I can't just be a diplomat, I have to be a techie too. I have to use the newest and most innovative ways to connect with them in order to change the narrative about what it means to be Muslim in 2011. I'm on Facebook, obviously, and I'm on Twitter. I work in communities plagued by misperceptions and negative narratives, as well as issues of extremism. One of the greatest challenges I hear from youth is the struggle with their identity. What is the difference between culture and religion? They want to know more about their peers in different parts of the world. They want to engage in the world in new ways and with each other. We are working to build new networks for new narratives. The youth are filled with energy and see a world of possibilities for change. They are looking for change on their planet to build stronger communities through things like entrepreneurship, health, education, volunteerism, and art. They seek new ways to engage, and games are one way to do that. Now, are you ready to help? I'm lucky that I get to open Tech at State, because I get to put forward my first challenge of the day to you. Help these young youth build games that do a wide variety of things. Help put a new narrative out there about what it means to be modern and Muslim. Help support leadership and coalition building and making connections across divides. Help build games that push back against extremist ideologies and other negative influencers. The games you will build will make what seems the unimaginable now tomorrow's reality. The youth in the world are powerful resources. They are shaking up the world with their tweets and their videos and their songs and their online campaigns. With more attention, we can provide new tools to address some key challenges and develop skill sets that can set a new generation of innovation in motion. Thank you again for your time this morning. I'm looking forward to hearing what happens today and all the momentum that is moving to go forward. The challenge that I put out to you is a real challenge. Your help in doing and building such games will make a difference to the planet in ways you cannot even comprehend at this moment in time. I look forward to your partnership. I wish you great luck today. Go out there and help us change the world. Thank you very much.
So I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is going to give you a keynote from the commercial gaming perspective. Arjun Sethi is the CEO of LOL Apps. They currently run a Facebook application called Ravenwood Fair, which is a sim Renaissance Fair application. I believe they have 25 million users. And he's going to talk about what's the commercial path and what's the commercial reality now for people in the industry who are developing and maintaining and growing a new generation of commercial games.
Morning, everybody. I'm going to grab some water. I don't have my speech is going to be a little bit more impromptu. On my way here, I thought about how this presentation was going to happen. And I was thinking if I talked specifically about games, it might get too detailed, but I just slide my way into how we sort of think about making games and how we also think about making social entertainment products, because games at the end of the day for us is a sort of just a facet of entertainment. So just to give a little bit of background about who I am. Today I sort of advise a bunch of companies. Groupon, Facebook, Google are part of them. And the way that I think about products and the way that a lot of people that I work with think about products is how do we build a product that is social at its foundation, and then how do we grow it from there? And I've been in the industry for about 10 years in the Silicon Valley. And what ends up happening is that we sort of think about growing products organically and trying to find influencers and trying to find a way so that we're not spending on marketing. We're sort of using myself or you and I, or someone who has, let's just say, a very sort of a strong will, or people listen to them. And in our industry, we call them influencers, or sort of nodes that sort of carry on and grow an application. My history is sort of, I'm from around the area. I grew up here. I went to school here for economics and history, based in University of Maryland. And sort of the time that I spent here, and one of the reasons why I moved back, was that I majored in Middle Eastern history. And from that, there was a lot of movements that sort of resonated with me in terms of like the Muslim Brotherhood and like Egypt, how they sort of broadcasted. And so the way that social networking works is it's sort of similar. It's at its root cause, it's sort of communication. And every product that you build is communication oriented. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the traditional methods of communication, I'll just go back to, I'm going to go back, for our space, 10 years is 50 years. So just going back to 99, like the methods of communication during that time was just the emergence of SMS, it was the emergence of email, and it was the emergence of like communication on the internet. So how many people are familiar with BBS, or the bulletin board services? Okay, that's good. I don't feel old then. And then obviously the telephone as well. So again, everyone sort of communicates in some way or some fashion, and every generation changes the way that they communicate. During my generation, I started communicating more by SMS and email, and the communication today, like my younger sister, she doesn't have email. All she communicates is by SMS and Facebook. For them, email is like it doesn't exist. And then over time, what's been happening is that social networking, or as a generation has been changing, and the way that they communicate globally is also changing. So, of course, the last person that came up here was talking about how they communicate, like in the Asia, India, China. It's mostly SMS related, and it's mostly just through the mobile phone. But they're also communicating through applications, is what we call it today. But it's just web portals. Twitter being amongst one of them. Twitter's like really popular in Japan. There's clones of that in India and Taiwan, et cetera, and sort of their own fastest, their own versions. And so again, when we've been building products on the open web, 2020 is going to be hindsight. We're going to say like that's how we thought about it. At that time, we just thought about how we were going to grow these things. But again, at the underlying foundation is that how do we think about building our products, or how do we think about building something that's going to be entertainment or enjoyable for the audience that we have? And so again, it started on the internet, and then we went to social networking. I'll tell you how this sort of evolved. Today, what you see is self-expression. People are very public with what they talk about. They might have thousands of followers. They might have 3 followers. It just depends on how relevant they are. It could be relative to their high school. It could be relative to religious areas, could be relative to specific types of things that are happening in a local area. Of course, when Obama got elected, it might seem that they spend a lot of money on marketing, but if you sort of look at how our generation, or some of the generation that's a little bit younger than me, thought about his campaign seemed very organic and seemed very real. And so when we're building products, and we're building it for the global audience, we think about it in the same way: is how do we sort of broadcast a product, or how do we get it out there to a certain audience without working too hard? And that seems a little counterintuitive, but what I mean by that is that I'm picking a certain person in this audience, and I feel that they're important somehow, and I take their importance and I leverage that and say, like, I want to try to use you to grow my application, grow my product, or grow my service at the end of the day. It's similar to how Groupon works. It's very similar to how Facebook started, and to a certain extent, it's very similar to how Twitter also sort of grew, and it's very broadcast-oriented. We've gone from broadcast to private networks to public networks to broadcast again, and today it's a lot about self-expression, and games is a part of that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But in every part of the world, it's a very different type of broadcast, and it's a very different type of expression. This is today on Facebook, I'm not sure if they publicly announced some of it, but there's essentially about between 600 and 700 million active users per month. This is just global, worldwide. As a company, and again, I'll talk a little bit more about what Lowell Apps is, but I mean, my whole company exists on the Facebook platform. It's about 90% of our business, it's about 90% of our social interactions, and it's about 90% of all the applications and games that we build on Facebook today. And so, has anybody seen this graph before of the Facebook connections? Okay, just one guy in the back. Essentially, you can see that China doesn't exist in this model. But this is basically all the connections and the nodes of the connections that exist in this Facebook space. And what you can see, there's a lot of direct correlations between Eastern United States, UK. There's a lot of correlations between India, UK, India, Australia, India, Philippines, Philippines, Australia, Mexico, Southern United States. And so when we think about the amount of data that we have when we're building these applications and we're growing our user base, we have a lot of data to, instead of being reactive to our customers or reactive to the global audience, we can be very proactive. We can see what they like, what they don't like, how they're interacting with the space, how as a community they're interacting, and how I can sort of tailor my products for that community, or tailor specific parts of the product to different communities and have them come into the game very differently, or come into the applications differently. Part of that is localization. Does anybody know what I mean by localization? Okay, I'll just explain it real quick. When we started off in the industry, localization just meant that we would just take a very dumb version of translations and we just slap it onto our products. Today, that means it's something very different. Localization basically means that, let's just say our game Ravenwood Fair, it's about building sort of a sim game or sim buildings, and the type of innuendos that I use here in the United States don't work in Brazil. So like if I have a Mother's Day holiday pack or something very specific catered to that campaign, that's not going to work in Brazil. They're going to look at that and say, this is, I don't really care. So localization basically means for each and every single country or specific area, it's more culturally dependent. We'll sort of look at that. So we have, like the Easter pack was very relative to Christian countries. For Muslim countries it wasn't, so we had more Ramadan flows during their time frame. So it might be the same product, but the way that those users interact with the product itself are going to be very different, and their experience is going to be completely different. So going back to this, there's just a huge amount of cross-pollination of users on Facebook, and the way that information spreads is it's very viral and it's very infectious, and that's what we study all day long, is how do we figure out a way to make our products viral and infectious at the end of the day? And for each and every geography and each and every location, it's very different. Philippines is a great example. At the end of the day, the United States has sort of like an ADD problem. We have so much content and we have so much stuff to look at that we can spend all day just looking at content. And for other countries, they don't have as much. So the way that I spread stuff virally or infectiously, let's just say in the Philippines, is very easy. Everyone does everything. You might, as you're building products and you have all this data, the Philippines they might just love everything you make, but your product still might not be that great. For the Philippines audience, it might be really great. So if you take into account the United States and you take into account the Philippines, it's a different way of looking at your products because they're content starved and the United States is not content starved. And so you can look at it the same way for like Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, which is a big market as well. Brazil just recently came up as well. So the way that sort of Facebook is going in the space, companies like us are going the same way. The mobile space is going in the same direction. And so what we try to do is we try to take as much data as we can and think about the type of products that we want to build. So as I was explaining before, the amount of growth that's been happening, I want to say in the last 2 years, it's just exponential. During the time frame around 2005, 2006, you would see the amount of users on Facebook. And I'm going to be very specific to Facebook as a network because it's the easiest one to talk about, and it's probably the one that has the most data that's going to be relevant for this audience as well. Most of Facebook's growth happened in the United States first, and then once they figured out how to grow in certain areas, they grew in the areas that I specified earlier, which was Mexico, UK, what we in the Silicon Valley call English-speaking countries, so UK, Australia, Canada, United States, and then it sort of grew from there. Asia became a pretty big hub as well, and the type of data that we got, again, was different in every single country. In Asia, they had a tendency to spread no matter if they were male or female, between the ages of 18 and 25. In the United States, it's mostly female. I don't want to say that men are sort of irrelevant here in the United States, but they have I guess by nature, they're very introvert here in the United States, and so they're not as outgoing, whereas females tend to share a lot more. So when we're catering our products, we look at female products for the United States, and then we don't, in sort of countries, a good example I can give you is Turkey. It's sort of 50-50. Male and female sort of interact and share the exact same way. Same in the Philippines. India is very similar to the United States. I think they're sort of copying what's happening in terms of like females share more, males are more introvert again. UK is also the same way. So this type of data gives us a lot of information around how we need to build our products, and also the type of products that we want to build, and how do we sort of quantify it and also qualify it towards our overall business needs. So I work for a company called Lol Apps. We're about 4 years old. We started on the Facebook platform. And to give you a little bit of background, we weren't making games first. What we started building were entertainment products. So how many of you guys have used any gifts or quizzes on Facebook? Okay. How many of you guys felt that's annoying? Well, that's all us. So we have the largest network on Facebook after Zynga, and it's a combination of gifts, quizzes, phrases. But it might be annoying for you guys. Of course, we're trying to always evolve the product, and as the platform has evolved, we changed the way that we're also building the products to be more quality-oriented. And it's also based on feedback. The way that you might answer a quiz or create your own quiz changes the way that we build our products for the future. And the amount of data that you give us also changes the way that we think about you as a person or you as a community. And so today on Facebook, we have about 1 million applications that exist. We have the most amount of applications on Facebook, and then we have the most amount of users in that network. And that really helps solidify us to try to figure out what type of games that we wanted to build and the audience that we wanted to build for. Typically for just social games, it's female is sort of the majority of the audience across the board internationally if you look at it from an average perspective. The amount of gifts that we've sent since we started are about 12 billion gifts, and that continues to rise. It's a very exponential number. I would assume that by the end of this year we'll hit about 15 to 20 billion gifts, and that's just the amount of information that people share. This is really important because this is actually, going back to what I was talking about from communication, this is how users communicate on Facebook. They send gifts to each other. They send requests to each other, and they want to find a way to share stuff. Has anybody ever sent e-cards to people via email? It's essentially the same concept by sending like pokes or sharing stuff on walls on Facebook. Just think of the way that users interact on Facebook, and that's like a steroids version of what you would send like an e-greeting card. It's just, these are interactions that happen every single day, and they happen at an exponential rate, and they happen faster and faster and faster. And it's a way that people feel tapped in. A good explanation was when I was at a previous conference, someone had talked about what this all really means is that if you are, let's just say this conference, ends, at the end of this day, a way that some people communicate are, by creating a group about this conference and continue the communication and continue that. Some people might make an application about this conference. I think that might be going a little overboard. But some people might actually create a group and just talk about what's been happening and how things have been evolving. And what happens is that this conversation doesn't stop. And so you can think about it the same way, is that every communication, every application, every entertainment philosophy that you look at that's happening on any of these networks happens through these communications, which is gifts, pokes, likes, what you're doing outside of Facebook and how that correlates back into Facebook, and how do you communicate that to your friends. Is anybody familiar with the Open Graph API on Facebook? Sort of what you like, what you don't like? Okay. All that information that you are when you like something on when you like something outside of Facebook, let's just say on CNN, that you're essentially sharing that with your closed network or your friend network on Facebook. Facebook has that data. Your friends have that data, and any applications or products that you've installed on Facebook has that data. And then when we see that data, what you like, what you don't like, we have a good idea of what we're doing in terms of, like, again, creating our product, how you're going to interact with products over the time frame, and how you sort of changed your behavior in, like, the last, let's just say, year. So in the traditional space, in like 5 years ago when we were building products, your behavior would change over a course of a year. Now people's behaviors change in a course of minutes to hours to weeks. So the way that we have to build products ends up becoming from a product life cycle from minutes to hours to weeks. So as a company, we do weekly cycles, which are our major releases, but we release every single day. We make different changes to the product. We make new features to the product because people are interacting with their products at a very rapid pace, which makes it frustrating but exciting at the same time. Has anybody heard the concept of data-driven versus data-informed? Okay. So in our space, a lot of what we I don't want to say grew up, but sort of culturally we went in a direction was that we need to be reactive to data, and then we need to be driven by that data, and then we need to cater to our users. And over time, we sort of changed that philosophy, and it's mostly because if we keep reacting to the data of what our users are doing, that means we're going to go wherever the users want us to go, instead of thinking about what's our ultimate goal and vision of the product or the message that we want to send out. And so what we do today is we take a lot of these factors, which is what are the interests of the users, what's our business interest. In my space, we're trying to figure out how to make money. So we need to figure out what the users like and dislike in terms of how they interact with the products, and so that we can essentially charge them microtransactions and costs. What's our strategic goal in terms of what we're trying to create as a product? My company is a little bit different from the other ones that are out there. Zynga makes game by game by game. We're trying to create a network of a multitude of games, but they're all interconnected, and I'll talk about that towards the end. And how are these all important? So we're more, instead of reactive, we're more proactive, is that we take this data and we say, what can we do with it, and how can we sort of evolve the product, and say 6 months from now we want our users to be here, what can we do to make them go in that direction? I'm saying this all at a high level. It can get a little bit more complicated, but there's just so much data about what the users are doing, how they're coming into the system. If you continue to just react to what they're doing, you end up looking like, I'm not going to name any products that are out there today, but you end up looking like a very discombobulated company or vision, and there are other companies out there that has sort of gone that route, and they're going through the frustrations today. So this is our game, Ravenwood Fair. It's a sim game. Essentially, it's a Snow White and Seven Dwarfs type Disney style game, if you want to say that's a style, just for everyone to sort of recognize it. We have about 25 million users across all networks. That's not just on Facebook, but Japan, in China, we're just about to launch Orchid, which is based in Brazil. So again, we have a global community, and then we have our games and applications. We sort of react to all those communities in a different way. So the products are very different in those regions. About 50% of our audience is international, and that's just everywhere outside when I say international, that's everyone outside English-speaking countries. One of our largest audiences are in the Middle East and Asia. Middle East more so because they spend more, and they spend a lot more time in the games, whereas the Asian countries, they spend a lot more time in the games, but they spend less money in the games themselves. And that has to do with a lot of factors. It's not that they don't want to pay, it's just that there's a lot of payment mechanisms that just don't exist over there. And lastly, going back to the data, when we launched Ravenwood Fair, we were able to sort of decipher that information. Again, we just had an unprecedented amount of information about just how the gamers reacted. And what we ended up doing was we saw how the users were very content-starved and very story-driven, and that's how sort of the Facebook games have evolved over time. And so we decided to create something similar to what World of Warcraft is, but on Facebook, and it's a very different philosophy. But has anybody played World of Warcraft here? Cool. So the gamer base, what we sort of define on Facebook, is about 300 million users. It's about half the Facebook population. And that's our sort of target audience at the end of the day. And again, that consists of global audience, that consists of the US audience, and they all also interact with each other very closely. And so the way that we're building it is that if you look at the picture up here, it's that each and every section is sort of its own application. This is just this is just a sketch of what we're going for, but this is what the audience thinks they're going to be seeing, that they're going to be traveling from one area to the next based on either myth, lore that we come up with, and then they install this application, and then they interact with that. And then the genres can be from building your own castle to building your own fair, or going on a story quest around sort of, prince, princess, saving the princess, etc. And so that's how we look at the space. This is what we do on Facebook and on other networks. It's very complicated, but very exciting at the same time. And then I'm more than happy to answer any questions in the meantime. So feel free. Go ahead.
You said you do a very rapid turnover for your development games.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of plan do you use? Agile or Scrum or?
It's a combination of a lot. A lot of people throw out the word agile development, lean development. They will also say Scrum development. It's essentially, at the end of the day, it's a combination of all. We have very small teams, and then those teams sort of react to data in a different way. So there's some teams that will react to just retaining, what we call retention internally. Some games are some teams are growth focused. So they all have their specific skill sets around what they're looking for and how they're going to improve the game. And then we just focus on those specific stats that are coming in and saying, like, again, what's the vision of the game and where is it going?
If you guys could go to the microphones to ask the questions, that way the people watching on video can hear the questions, or if you want to repeat them.
I'll just shout out.
Sure.
You guys, how important is music? How do you acquire it? Music in the game. Could you repeat the question then?
Sure. He asked how important is music and how do we acquire it, and then specifically the music in the game. So when we first started on Facebook, music didn't matter at all. And again, I think it's just about how the audience evolves over time, and then how and what kind of content they have, right? As more competition comes, as the production quality changes, as the way they interact, graphics, etc. They're asking for more of that quality. So I want to say a year ago, music probably wasn't very important. It's just something in the background. Today, it's very important in terms of, it's not something that we can measure. So when I go back to data informed versus data driven, if I was data driven, music, there's no way to measure like how music gets affected in my game and how important it is. But from a qualitative aspect, we know that as we've changed music and higher quality or music interaction within the game, like the way that you place your building or the way that your character interacts with that building, the music might change. So it's very important. And then the way that we acquire it is we create it ourselves. Go ahead.
Obviously, you guys have like tens of millions of users for your games.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of strategies for marketing did you use to reach that? Did you just create the game and hope that people join it? Did you do kind of an ongoing thing where you reached out to particular networks saying, hey, check this out?
Sure. So his question was that we have tens of millions of users in our system. How did we get those users? What were the strategies that we used? The user base that we have on Facebook today, we have about 100 million users total. And so the way that we grew that, there's just a variety of different ways. But at a high level, we grew it organically, and we grew it through the techniques that I had talked about earlier, which was how do you identify specific key influencers? How do you get them to spread the word? The products grew organically first, which are the non-games. Over time, as the games came on, they're inherently a little bit less, when I want to say infectious and viral, but you have to try to figure out a way for them to grow. And so you still use the same techniques, and you still try to find those specific users that are very share-oriented. So again, specific countries that are very, very share-oriented are Philippines. The southern part of the United States is very share-oriented for games. It's a younger audience. So what we'll do is we'll target customers or users between the age of 16 to 25, mostly females. And they share a lot. They won't pay a lot, but they share a lot. And then they'll share with like the next group, which is like 25 to 35, and then there's another group, 35 to 45. And again, this is all female-oriented. And so that's sort of how the game grows. And then you have to be very specific about how you target those users so that if you are going to be spending money, that you're measuring that, and then you're following their nodes that, as I explained before.
What kind of mechanisms do you use for payment, and how do you allow your users to kind of use them more impulsively so you can encourage them to participate?
Sure. So his question was, what type of payment mechanisms do we use? Sorry, what was the other part of the question?
Oh, yeah, and how do you have users encourage them to be more impulsive with their kind of like purchasing and stuff? You talk about like Asia versus the Middle East and how some, they pay more or less.
Sure. And then the other part was, how do we make the users more impulsive to pay? That's a great question, and that's changed dramatically over time. So when we first started, payments was a major pain on Facebook, and it's a global society. So and the way that people take payments, it's very different. So in the United States, credit card is very, it's everywhere, and so everyone uses it. In Germany, it's not. People use their bank SWIFT code. In the Philippines, people use an SMS payment to their carrier. Carriers in those countries take 80% of the revenue, right? So we had to do different techniques. There's a system called offers, basically, where users could get a certain amount of credits, currencies in the game, which is actually how we all monetize, and I should probably talk about that. And then we can offer some of those currencies to them based on them signing up for Netflix or signing up for specific ringtones. There's just a lot of other things as well, or sending flowers during Mother's Day. You'll get a certain amount of credits in the game, and then those companies will pay us. So there's different payment mechanisms. Again, every country is different, and every offer in those countries is different. So I'll talk about the United States first. About 2 years ago, we just used to use the credit card system. And then over time on Facebook, they've created their own currency called Facebook Credits. And then they have their own payment mechanisms, which use PayPal, credit card. And then they've gone about going in every country so that we don't have to do that work. Which is Taiwan, they have their own gamer card system, Turkey gamer card system as well. And so it's a lot of prepaid amount. It's like an ATM card at the end of the day. It's like a prepaid debit card. They pay a certain amount of money for it. And then they register it when they're playing our game, and then they put in the code, and then they just say that this is the amount that they want to pay. The impulsive part has changed a lot. When we first started, items could cost from $5 to $30. Now they cost from 10 to 50 cents. And to make it more impulsive, what we do is we start charging people as little as possible right in the beginning of the game, so they don't feel like the game is very expensive. And if they really like the game, then over time we'll ramp them up at a higher cost. At a higher price point. It really depends on the user base. There are some games out there that start off at the hundreds of dollars, and there's some games that start off at 10 cents. We specifically start off around 10 cents.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about A/B testing, the data-driven approach,
Sure.
and the experimentation that I'd imagine that you do, and that I'm aware that Zynga does.
Sure.
And whether you could say how that's informing you about the users.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I'll try to take a specific set. Are people familiar with what A/B testing means or split testing means? Essentially, what we're doing is we're trying to take one variable and say here's a constant variable, and you want to change one feature and see how that, which is another variable, and see how that changes sort of the overall health or the overall scope of what we're trying to do and what we can change. So one might be if I have a certain amount of users in the Philippines, and let's just say for every user that's in the Philippines, they invite 10 or they invite 1. That might change depending on sort of the way that we have a flow structure in our game. But once we change that flow or we test that flow, we'll see if they invite 1 or they invite less than 1 or over over 10. Again, it depends. Specifically around A/B testing, for the application space, non-games, I want to say the quantitative methods are much easier because you're testing colors, you're testing how people react to a placement of a button. You might change it here and there. You might test 10% of your audience and see how they react. And you just get a massive amount of data because you have millions of users, so you can say, hey, this one works better than the other. So that's what A/B testing means at the end of the day. We do that constantly. In the games, we do that a little bit less because it's very, well, I'm not sure how to do it, and a lot of the guys that are much smarter than me at my company are still trying to figure out how to do it, but games at the end of the day are, it's qualitative. Like, even if you're making a movie or you're writing a book, there's a lot of creativity that goes into it. So you can't really A/B test creativity. So what you try to do is you try to find specific control variables within what you're trying to create to see what you can test and see how you can react to it. But at the end of the day, if you're trying to make a good game, it has to be good, and then you can make tests after that. But it's very hard to sort of test and say, like, is this game going to be good right from the beginning? I think that's what you were trying to ask. We don't do any A/B testings around how to build a game, but we will do A/B testing around like the type of creatives that work versus what don't work. So we might create, like when we just tested Ravenwood Fair, like the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs style of buildings versus something that looked very, let's just say SimCity style. Has anybody played Cityville on Facebook? That style of building is very different, right? It's very modern looking. So test those types of things and seeing what works, what doesn't. And if something has a higher conversion rate of the amount of people that click and want to come into the system, then you'll end up going in that direction. Again, those are just specific examples.
I think we're going to do these 2 questions, and then we'll have to wrap up this section.
Okay, actually, that last answer segues nicely into my question. I know you worked with Brenda Brathwaite and John Romero on Ravenwood Fair,
Yep.
two designers that have decades of combined experience in the industry, but not specifically in the Facebook or social game space. And you've talked a bit about data-informed and data-driven development, but I'd love to hear about the challenges or conflicts that you face when you're trying to design game mechanics from a data-informed and data-driven perspective. So instances where perhaps you might have wanted to put something in a game, but the data suggests not to.
Sure. So that's a great question, actually. We did have a lot of challenges. So the coming up with the game is the hardest part, right? And so what we did is we relied on traditional game mechanics and traditional game developers that are out there. And they came up with sort of a framework of what they wanted the game to be. And it ends up being the overall theme of what the game should be. So after they created that, we'll look at specific mechanics that have been working on Facebook, specific mechanics that are working outside of Facebook, and seeing how we can sort of bridge the gap. At the end of the day, in our space, product managers are like the owners of their own product, and game designers are the owners of the game, and they have to come together and work in. It was a bit of a challenge, but it was fun at the same time because they're learning sort of how we look at the space, again, from a quantitative aspect. What we've learned already over time, we don't want history to repeat itself, make mistakes, and whereas they come from a very instinctive background, which is like, this would be fun. So there was a lot of mishmash and there was a lot of headbutting, but at the end of the day, what happens is that you have to be happy with what you're coming out with. And then as soon as you release it out there and you have tens and millions of users playing in the game, you know what you did wrong and what you did right. A great example I can give you is just the way that the buildings were placed when you were buying it in a store, or the way that people were leveling up in the curve. We thought it might be better if we made it more expensive for higher level users, but it ended up happening was that it was too expensive at like a specific level, going from like level 5 to level 6. So from a data perspective, that helped us, saying that a lot of the users from level 5 to level 6 stopped playing the game because it was way too hard, right? So, but a person that's playing a game or started creating this game, if they weren't looking at the data and if they were going by pure instinct, would not realize that.
Okay, last question.
You mentioned a couple of countries and regions that where users are particularly engaged. Could you comment on how Latin America compares, excluding Brazil, in terms of user engagement and level of participation?
Sure. Excluding Brazil, I would say Mexico and Argentina are probably like the largest populations that play the game. They also react very, very, very differently. I'll probably talk about Mexico a little bit more. So when we come out with a game in English, they don't care. It doesn't make a big difference for them, and they don't interact in the game the same way. So when I was talking about A/B testing, when we measure the conversion of how many users are playing the game in Mexico, when we translate it and localize it into their language versus when we had it in English, it's a vast difference. The moment we change the game into Spanish in the way that, basically we're more thoughtful about how they interact with the game and their culture, and then we change the game in accordance with that. They engage much, much higher, and they ended up engaging in the game much higher than the people that are playing it sort of like in the southern tip of the United States and in the coastal areas. And so, I mean, they interact in the game very differently than what I would say the traditional users that interact here in the United States. Again, the traditional users here in the United States are like 35 and up female. Over there, it's a younger audience. It's skewed more towards younger, and I think it's because they're more sort of infatuated, and they're also, when I talked about self-expression and social network, they're the ones that are just more in tune with that, whereas like the fastest growing populations for social network in the United States is above 50, and over there, the fastest growing population is between 18 and 25. I think it just really depends on that population. So they spend a lot of time in the game. They spend a lot less. But Latin America is a big focus for us in the long term. Thank you.
All right, I would like to introduce Ben Sawyer, who I view as the elder statesman of serious games. He's been running the Serious Games Conference since 2002. He also runs Games for Health and has a radar that includes everyone who's basically doing anything anywhere in the world about games that's not purely for entertainment purposes. So without further ado, Ben.
Okay, that's the first time I've ever been called an elder statesman. I guess that really means my 40th birthday is next month. I don't know how this works, so I'm going to bear with me as, where can I see my slides? They're not here. Is there overhead? Okay, so I have to look this way? Okay, that's okay. Enjoy this better side. Okay, so I'm just here to kind of try and level set a little bit. So what I've got is a little bit of why we're making the case for serious games, a little bit of sort of my perceptive thought patterns as to how it might apply to this world, and then a little bit about how we can do this and what kind of works. And it's fairly high level, but hopefully it kind of frames further discussions, especially tomorrow for the unconference side of things, which I'm looking forward to. So games and diplomacy have gone together for quite some time. The game diplomacy exists. Many people in this audience probably played it at some point. And then, of course, Genghis Khan in Civ 4 or 5, and you have to do some basic diplomacy with these characters. I will make the point, though, that as interesting as civilization tries to be about these things, everything basically devolves to war. So it's not far off, right? All games are serious. We're going to talk about what we collectively call the serious game space, but playing games is something that I take very seriously. Entertainment is a serious pursuit of mankind, and people who are alive in the world and entertaining and having fun with their friends and their family members and others, this is nothing to sneeze at, but the point is it's been so powerful in that medium or that particular sector, we should be really thinking about how we can widen the utility of games and game technologies. I always tell you what I've been playing lately. I think it's important that people who talk in this space show you this slide. Even if it just shows you Pac-Man, you know where they're coming from, you have a sense of what's going on, and on top of that, maybe you learn a few games that are worth playing. So there's some Facebook games, some iPad games, Lego Star Wars, which I'm playing with my son, and of course Red Dead Redemption, sort of your AAA title. Of course, this is really all I'm doing. I'm playing Minecraft as much as possible, and this is a building that it took me about a couple of months to build with my son. Anybody who plays Minecraft, that's brick, and it was not just cheated to build. So you can understand the time. This is the Games for Health conference, which we just finished last week, which is why I'm still tired. But this was 3 days, over 125 speakers, over 80 sessions. Really incredible stuff. Keynotes from Google and from Dr. Martin Seligman of the Positive Psychology Center at UPenn, who I'll talk about in a bit. And I invite you all to come next year. So what are serious games? Well, it starts with the fact that there's these two sort of underlying rules in technology, Moore's law and Metcalfe's law, and these basically describe the sort of exponential gain of technology. So how many transistors we can put on a chip every 2 years and the cost structure of that. as well as the exponential gain for every new person who joins a network. So what happens here is we start with very basic games, and Moore's Law and Metcalfe's Law take over, and we get something Red Dead Redemption, which is a media extravaganza. And while not every game is a AAA title, what's going on is you see something that amazing, and it's come that far, and you can look at some of these alternative game design patterns, things that are not like super high-res graphics, but have very interesting, powerful capabilities on their own, from everything from alternate reality games to things like Yville and Habbo Hotel, which have millions of players, to simple HTML-based fantasy sports games, which have millions of players in interesting social network settings. And so people respond to this. They're responding to that power curve of interaction, the power curve of media, the power curve of simulation, and the ability to have this emotional sort of response in a very deep way. And these are some great pictures that were done by this photographer that show you the emotional responses. This, it's not enough to look at what's on the screen. You have to look at what's going, point the camera the other way. And this really, without giving you empirical evidence, gives you some sense of what's going on. I very rarely would ever see someone do that at a movie as much anymore. This looks more like an amusement ride in that sense. So what you get is this possibility gap. If you look at what most e-learning and productivity applications require today, the sort of baseline set of systems that power most enterprises, be they NGOs, government, or enterprises, you sort of top out around on the Moore's Law and Metcalfe Law power curve somewhere around 2002. But what is sort of the largest application structure that, outside of like some high performance computing needs, that has really pushed the edge of desktop based power? And that's been video games. So the reason why we have serious games in the biggest sense, in the modern context, is that leadership of all levels inside organizations, big and small, are realizing that there's something more powerful in what they see on these consoles, on these iPads, on these mobile phones, and in their living rooms than what they're getting at their desktops at work. And they're saying that they didn't get to the top or near the top in these leadership organizations not knowing arbitrage, not knowing how to exploit a potential situation. And that doesn't mean that we're doing it perfectly, but it's really clear that there's some differential there that we're trying to take advantage of. So serious games is the use of video games and game technologies for purposes beyond entertainment. That's the simplest explanation I've been able to develop. But what I could talk about is, let's take this apart a little bit more. And so I wrote this sentence. This is a sort of a thought process that I've had where I'm trying to match up some ideas around the theory of all this as I learn it and explore it myself, relevant to what games are. So forget for a fact about games, the sort of core definition of games being challenges and goals and all these things. But let's think about them in terms of what we're actually asking from them in this context. So they're accessible interfaces. They're very easy to pick up and play with. And they're interactive and they're iterative. So we play these things over and over again often. And they're representational frameworks. So they're not necessarily meant to be perfect frameworks. They're not, even though games use a lot of simulation, it does not mean that the goal of a game is the pursuit of fidelity, the way a particular simulation lab might pursue it. It's more about the user experience and those representational frameworks that you can get that ultimately try to motivate sort of mastery. And we could sort of look at this and start lining up various ideas in terms of learning theory, behavior change that we think about. So what about, does all of this lead, and this is the big question that I've had since starting in this in 2002, and before that doing a serious game all the way back to 1999, is this notion of, do we get comparative advantage? So a lot of the times, one of the things that I'm kind of curious about when somebody's talking to me about a particular problem that they're trying to solve is I sort of first ask myself, has this been like an intractable problem? Like it's sort of, if you're talking to me, why didn't anything else work before? What particular advantage are you trying to do? And always trying to kind of ask myself over and over again, what are the kinds of advantages and how do we find those advantages? So we started working on this a little bit. This is some recent work where we're trying to look at 4 sort of different areas that maybe this kind of comes together under. And we could sort of look at these by lining up some different ideas about cognition, linguistics, psychology, and technology. You see the sort of networks going back to Metcalfe's law, computational media sort of drawing from Moore's law a little bit. But again, not just this notion of pedagogy, not just this notion of learning, but also the notion of behavior change, which tells you a lot about what's going on in games for health. So we could sort of translate these a little bit more into sort of the computer and sort of video game realm, and we think about them in terms of interface, the sort of transfer mechanisms that we're looking for, the overall utility. And often in the serious game space, what we forget about is that sometimes what we're trying to transfer is the core utility of games, the ability to push them out to millions of people, to use very low-cost networks, but to take an existing pedagogy or system that's worked, such as live-action role-playing, and move it into a computerized environment so that we could take advantage of some core utilities that were afforded by computer systems and networks. And then, of course, systems, the ability to model, visualize, and simulate some of these worlds at varying levels of fidelity. But of course, really what goes on is the combination of this. And this is what kind of makes it hard. It's the combination of all these different things. If you really want to find great serious games research, you sort of have to look for it everywhere. I have reams of it, but it's from every different journal you can possibly imagine. So it's not all housed in one place. It draws on so many different things, and this is what's made, part of it makes it so difficult, because it is really so interdisciplinary. So what's special about games, though? So for me, the number one special thing about games is gameplay, the notion of playing these things. And it's really the process of gameplay is perfected by really good designers and development teams and circumstances. And then we have these specific attributes. I sort of called some of them out, but I sort of call it like the micropsychology of games. And this is where you start to match up different ideas like score and graphics and story and rewards. And some of this you're starting to see play out in the gamification movement. What gamification in my mind is they're trying to extract some bits and pieces of that micropsychology, apply them outside of a more well-formed game experience, and seeing if that plus productivity style applications can kind of mash up and be something better than it was in terms of the productivity side beforehand. The difficulty is whether or not they're bringing enough to the whole equation, or if they're just trying to take a part of the equation and promise you everything. But there's definitely bits and pieces of that have been working. Then it's this optimization. And I think when we heard about A/B testing and other things, testing is so important in the optimization of the user's experience, how they perceive what it is you're putting forward is what's so paramount to this. And in doing that, game developers often purposefully abstract the underlying content. So that they can basically pull, almost like an editor, it's the what, why, where, when. It's not every last detail. It's enough so that the person can put themselves in that frame of mind. And this is why sometimes we look at games and we kind of wonder if they're really the perfect solution. Not every game is meant to be Flight Simulator. At the same time, the question becomes, can we combine these things? Can we take what's great about a game, combine it with a professor or a teacher or a trainer or some other surrounding context where we fill in these blanks? But so we're pouring this additional information into that framework that's been established by the game. So to me, what really becomes special is this combination of the process of creating games and the process of playing them, and the feedback cycles that go on in between, and optimizing those different pieces together. That's what happens in commercial games. Really great commercial games were brilliantly created and conceived, but they were conceived out of the constant cauldron of feedback that comes from the game playing community. So does any of this work? So we could look at some studies. Obviously, these are very power-packed slides, and I can make them available afterwards. But again, some studies, this one of management courses, one using a game, one not using a game. And in this case, they weren't teaching with the game. They were making the game available as an adjunct to the class that allowed the students to go in and do additional work. And they got higher test results. I was happy that they actually used one of my games. Remission is a behavior change game aimed at pediatric cancer patients. It embeds information about cancer and fighting cancer within the game, both with cutscenes that sort of explain things, but also in the game's procedural rhetoric, as Ian Bogos would use. The actual rules of the game dictate that you have to fight cancer to the very last cell or it's going to come back. And so that is embedded within the game. And of course, they got some great results out of this. They are continuing to improve it. They're working on, I think, a new version. But what they found was significant. West Virginia did some work with Dance Dance Revolution, rolling it out as a particular exercise regimen. What's important in this context, besides the fact that they found that there was efficacy here, was that, and it's not on this slide completely, is that they found a very particular segment of people responded to the idea of DDR as an alternative PE solution. It wasn't, the kids who were responding to this, especially young tween-age males, had shunned other opportunities for alternative forms of physical ed. And then it also then became a stepping stone to getting back into things like biking and running and doing other, what we would consider normalized senses of activity. Hope Lab, which made remission, did some subsequent studies of people in exercising kids and asking them, and found a similar psychographic profile in their work. And what this says is that there's opportunities to reach certain audiences with games that we weren't reaching before. In the case of electromagnetism supercharge in an MIT-based project, what was interesting was not only did they find a little bit of difference pre-test, post-test with both boys and girl groups in terms of this physics education, but they found that the female players actually had a larger gain as a cohort, not absolutely, but relatively to their previous scores. And there was some sense that the exploration sort of style of the game may have contributed to that. But the other thing is that what they called out in their research, they did some depth interviews. You could see below, I love this interviewer who asks the game player, and the game player has this very rich definition of what's going on and really can explain it through their gameplay. And then they ask another person who had scored fine, how did you know that? And why do you think it looks like that? Because I don't know, the teacher said so. And I just regurgitated it properly for you. So this, what this slide should talk to you about a little bit is not just whether or not these games can work, but the way you find out if they're working or exactly what's actually underlying it may require a little bit more of an in-depth interview process and really looking at how people are thinking, not just whether or not they're getting the answers right. Wolf Quest was another project recently assessed, and they found this was a sort of public project to raise, to spread science in a more informal context, not necessarily in a classroom. And again, they found some nice self-reported knowledge gains. And this was an NSF-funded project, and I believe they're pretty happy with the results. We can also look at biology. So Hope Lab took remission and presented it both in interactive form and passive exposure, meaning the person got to see the game played but didn't actually play it. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I actually had some sense that more is going on in the interactive play slide or picture than in the other, and specifically some of the sections that are being illuminated a little bit more with blood flow in the interactive play deal with things like motor control, memory, and some emotional areas. This is very early, but you're going to see a lot more of this. And in the Games for Health space, we're seeing tons and tons of work to biometrically measure what's going on as a result of the game, moving past sort of the pre and post test and depth interview styles that you see in more learning contexts. And I think this is going to be a very robust field, both moving into learning as well. There's some great researchers both at LIU and not only at Stanford where these were done, but at University of California, San Francisco that are doing some research work with Robert Wood Johnson Health Games research money to look at this process and really kind of get a better understanding of what's going on. Of course, you can also look at studies that tell us maybe it isn't going to work all the time. This was a project, I'm very proud that they put out their information where they failed. But essentially, one of the things that they did here was they told the kids, tomorrow in math class, you'll get to play a game. And then they brought in this very, Windows application looking, sort of confusing 3D thing that they thought they were building a game. And they really got some very disappointing negative comments from kids. They also found a lot of problems with the computer lab and the unproductive setting. They hadn't really thought about exactly where and how it was going to be played. And as somebody said, one game was really just awful and in fact reported it was worse than math class. And this really speaks to the fact that, remember Red Dead Redemption, remember Minecraft, remember all those games I showed you I'm playing lately. There is a perceptive definition of video games to people when you tell them they're going to get a game, especially to people who play video games. And it's not that you have to build Red Dead Redemption to get a result, but you do have to bring some level of craftsmanship to the level of whatever you're building, be it even a simple SMS game, to a Facebook game, to something even bigger than that. It really needs to be polished. You really need to think it through. And you can't just promise someone something in absence and expect them to show up and not bring a little level of cognitive dissonance to the table, which can be shattering to your heartfelt plans. Commercial games, we hold these up, right? This is why we're here. This is why they're so incredible. This stuff is amazing, and they're so brilliant, and we should learn everything from them. And if we just turned over all of our ideas to them, they would brilliantly produce things that blew us away. The fact is, they don't do this in their own business every day. Yes, we make incredible games in the games industry, and we make a lot of failures. It's hard. It's hard there. It's harder in serious games. But don't just think that it's this magic bullet in that sense either. And so you can see their own results. So simple. Games can work, and projects can fail. We should move past the idea that whether or not games can potentially help, whether or not you need ultimate proof. You're most likely not going to get the proof that is perfectly to what your situation is. We're not in the business of doing 10,000 studies before we build 10,000 games to prove that your particular need is going to work. But we can see that good serious game projects have had some level of success, and we know good commercial games have had some level of success. And it's our job to unpack those and figure out how to bring that success over to us and hopefully not have our projects fail. What about how we can use them? So this is a serious games taxonomy that myself and Peter Smith at University of Central Florida, who's now at the ADL CoLab, did, where we took the sort of different sectors of the economy down the left-hand side, and then across the top, the very big areas where games were being used: health, advertising, training, education. We've even seen them in science and research, production, and even just as forms of work themselves. And what we tried to do here was, let's see, it's a very small pointer. We tried to sort of show you, like, games for education, and then education as a practice gives you sort of learning games. And what we were trying to do is, learning might appear a few other places, but as you move away from this, you get into some very different ideas, like visualization and epidemiology. We're a long way from learning, folks, unless you want to devolve everything to that. That's fine. But often, the serious game space, depending on who you hear from, you would walk out saying, this is games for learning, this is games for training. But it's so many different things. And, at first you think this is conjecture, but, this slide's like 3 years old. Someday I'll update it. But these are examples of games in each one of those boxes. So even 3 years ago, whether it was a prototype, a shipping game, a piece of research, there were people specifically working towards each of those boxes. And in fact, I think we can get up to about 80% now, and certainly multiple examples in each one. We've even built these taxonomies out at lower levels. This is the one that we use right now for health and healthcare, and we're actually going to revise this with some information from our latest conference. But again, what you see going on here is a lot of different ideas. And at first you would say, well, wait a minute, informatics, public health, this idea of epidemiology, but there's been 3 or 4 really interesting either papers or projects that speak to how researchers in computational epidemiology have been using video games and instances of viral outbreaks in video games to update and enhance their own modeling and research in the area. Very, very cool. We can look at advertising, which in terms of thinking about things like public diplomacy, public affairs, What's important here is that while we have standalone AVR games, we have things like in-game placement, out-of-game placement, banner ads, interstitials, and then we even have games that are inside ads. So Volvo ran a bunch of ads using footage of a Volvo car inside a video game and then just took that footage and said, aren't we cool? Put it up on television. Coca-Cola, I mean, you don't get any better than that in terms of, well, maybe not in other things, but in terms of advertising, you don't get any better than that. And they decided they were going to be buddy-buddy with World of Warcraft in China. So when Coca-Cola decides it needs to stand next to a video game in order to affect its worldwide marketing, I think that should raise them, basically make you wake up to the opportunity that what's going on in an even bigger way is this ascendancy of global game culture and the association of people next to games, not even as games, is becoming a bigger and bigger deal. You can even reuse hardware. So you've got up here, this is Wii controllers reshaped into a laparoscopic surgery trainer. This is some 3D modeling done inside with the Kinect cameras. There's lots of interesting hacks going on with Microsoft's Kinect and Sony's Move. And then, of course, we have Xbox controllers in wired form because you don't want to hack them, being used by the military. Okay, so some random thoughts, right? Like sort of give you a real, nosedive into the sort of serious games framework. But I wanted to think a little bit about how they would be used maybe in your context. And since I don't necessarily work every day in diplomacy and world economic global development, take this for what it is. So the first thing is just thinking about frameworks. I'm very interested over the next day or so to build out some ideas of what kinds of frameworks. So sort of similar taxonomies that you saw me show before. So I'm thinking like, okay, we have, we have to go back. We have diplomacy, and then we think about maybe sort of official or professional channels, but then this notion of public diplomacy. I don't know if Doug Thomas made it, but they've been doing some really interesting work on looking at how massively multiplayer worlds are new forms of public diplomacy inside video games, and very interesting. So we can also look at this idea we can inform populations, but we can also potentially train them and educate them. And we can educate and develop them along maybe these big sort of 5 big areas. And again, this is just open for conversation. But some other frameworks we could look at, of course, the Millennium Developmental Goals. There's actually, I don't know if they're here, but USC, I've been working a little bit with them on this idea of a game for the 1,000 Days campaign for global health, as well as there's the Alive to 5. We just had Martin Seligman at our conference. I don't know how many people know who he is, but he's the father of positive psychology. And he's been really looking at this idea that we can build health assets within people. We can actually make them more resilient. We can make them happier through a variety of basic understandings and tools that we can apply to them. And he's very interested in looking at using games to take some of their positive psychology training, which they're just doing person to person right now, and turn them into a worldwide affair. Jane McGonigal, who is well known for her ARG work and some of her efforts like Urge and Evoke and World Without Oil, is a big fan of Dr. Seligman's work and is applying it to some of her ideas. Of course, we could look at things like microloans, whether those work. There's frameworks there potentially. But Martin Seligman talks about the idea that if we could take all of his ideas and we could push these out on a global scale, his goal is to see 51% of people testing out at the flourishing end of his psychology scales by 2051. Very global sort of thinking in that regard. And of course, we can look at these as potential frameworks to give us sense of, should have been something else, but targets is what I was getting at. Let's look a little bit about games and learning and behavior, though. It's enough to think of games as learning cauldrons, but they're also behavioral cauldrons. And what's interesting to me is that what we really need to start thinking about is how we combine these two things, because just to teach someone does not necessarily change their behavior. Some people it will, a lot of people it won't. And so we have to think about how we combine theories of behavior change with learning and behavior theories. Just as an example, they gave a bunch of kids in the UK brain age. They didn't give it to them because they wanted to improve their neuroplasticity, and that's open to debate with some of these games. It was because there was a very simple math game embedded in it. This is a portable device, and they basically tested it against another sort of math package called Brain Gym, and then controls, and you can see that the Nintendo group scored slightly higher. There's been some other examples of this. In Chile, they did a study with the original Game Boy with some math and reading games We did a project for Cisco where we did some similar testing. And what was interesting was we basically got what I call the new age of drill and skill. So you think of drill and skill as a very low-level pedagogy, practice a lot. This is kind of where we're trying to move away from with games. We're trying to build richer environments. But think about it as behavior change. The reason these scores were probably going up was they were iterating through more problems. It was a portable device they could carry with them all the time. They were basically doing their homework more. We weren't necessarily teaching them better, we were getting them to practice more. And in certain types of learning, practice is an important asset of it. So to me, this really speaks to just an opening salvo about how we might combine some of the knowledge around behavior change ideas and learning through games. This was the slide you were supposed to see before that, which was back to the frameworks. It's the sense we really need good targets in serious games. I see a lot of interesting stuff in the sort of games for good, games for change area, but it's a lot of it self-motivated, and often, and we see this in health too, this is the problem where the building that was endowed to do research in cancer was endowed by somebody whose mom died of cancer. And in fact, if you talk to cancer researchers, they would actually say we actually need to, or health researchers, they'd say we need to move some of this money into other areas that don't get a lot of attention because mom didn't die that way. Same thing with this sort of other area. We need better targets from this community. I mean, to me, I might get up tomorrow and think, oh, well, the problems in global health are X because that's what I see on the news or that's what I perceive. But it's not necessarily the best target. And then I start sitting down and writing a game about it. You know, it can end up not really what we want. We can look at platforms as well. When we think in a global context, we have to really rethink platforms. And it was interesting to see that we had sort of social gaming discussion here opening. Obviously, the new, most exciting platform for video games right now. But of course, we have laptops, we have smartphones and tablets, but do those really make it out on a global context? Really there, we have more like feature phones, Java, or even just a lot of SMS and sort of WAP-style programming. ZMQ Software has probably one of the largest serious games in terms of an impact level on HIV in India. And it's basically a very simple trivia-style game wrapped in cricket on a feature phone. You know, we could pick at it because it's not like the most amazing game ever built, but it really fit the platform, it fit the country, and they got some results as part of that. So hats off to them. Of course, we see lots of internet cafes, and then we have to think about connectivity. Even if somebody has a rich computing device, how particularly connected are they to the internet? Is it sporadic? Is it intermittent in an internet cafe? So thinking about how those platforms are is really about thinking about who are we really helping and how are we doing that? And often I will sometimes start there on projects like this, just because if I can understand that context better, then I can start worrying about the design a little bit more. So connectivity, though, we could think differently about this. It's not just the internet. We could think about the fact that, well, we might want to build games for lots of people. Maybe the real way to build games is to build better games for the people who go out into the world and do face-to-face training, or who are, you know, developmental officers and things like that. We avoid the technology issues. We bring the technology to the person who needs it most, who can then be the one-to-many relationship in the world. We could bridge networks. We've looked at ideas where we use SMS codes between a laptop that's not connected and a game that's giving special SMS-like codes that it can send or receive through the phone. You type them in, sort of like the old way we used to save and load games on Nintendo 8-bit platforms so long ago. What's interesting about that is if we're using the phone to send a simple message that the game told us to send to a server, we're getting even just little bits and pieces of useful connectedness. We know somebody played the game. We know it played it to some sort of standpoint. Maybe now we've captured their number, or we can engage them in a conversation through SMS to create that kind of bridged relationship. And then we could also we also have to think about connectedness in serious games as looping people back to the organizations. The game is not going to be the last thing that they touch, hopefully. If we're doing some sort of game about teaching people how networks work, perhaps now we want to loop them back to Cisco network academies throughout the developing world, where they really can take that initial knowledge and framework into a real organization where we can actually get a deeper level of change. So to wrap up a little bit, When I think about this audience, I think about this idea of games for everyone, like this notion of globalness. And you have to kind of rethink this a little bit, because really a lot of serious games, including some of the things I talked to you about, they tend to be very narrow. For instance, the cancer game, I made the note last week in my talk at Games for Health. I said, remission is amazing. It did a great job. But is it really a game for everyone? I'm not a 13-year-old or an 8-year-old with cancer, and nor do I want anybody to be. But that's not a health game for everyone. And we've tended to have some sort of one of the ways we pick good targets is sometimes being very narrow to them. And I think it's time that we started thinking a little bit wider at times as well, and thinking about what are games that everyone on the planet should play, and that would be useful if they did. So an example, really simple example, might be a first aid game. If everybody on the planet had some level of good first aid training, this would put someone with that training closer to someone who needs it. And we all know that when somebody needs sometimes first aid help in the difference between life and death, that it really is a time and distance problem. So again, an example of doing something like that that could have a very wide effect, and we could get it into the hands of almost everybody. And we can think about this beyond the health context, but I'm purposely right now thinking about it in health. The other thing that we could think about is that one of the problems in the serious game space is that in order to build games the way we're building computer games today, is we tend to close them off. They tend to be simulations of a certain number of factors, certain number of scenarios, certain number of moves or options available to the player. But when I think of diplomacy, when I think of the world that goes on outside of this room, it's not a closed set, right? Things change rapidly. People do things that you never expected. The world's much more complex. And so we need to think about how we might build games away from closed possibility sets, which is how we build them today, and think about the systems that might give us more open possibility sets. So how we bring humans into the loop and create these frameworks where we can have somebody who says, yeah, I'm going to do something you never thought was possible before. I commonly think about this when I was playing Balance of Power a long time ago. A friend of mine and I decided we'd invade Canada from the United States, right? The game's not really prepared for it. It sort of allows you to do it, but it wasn't the same experience as the détente with the Soviet Union, which it was optimized for. So I want the Invade Canada game. And that's not just because I live in Maine and I want to restart the Aroostook War. So we're thinking about some ideas on this within our shop, and we're looking at ways you crowdsource and use social networks and other kinds of expert engines to bring into something that maybe is more open. You don't have to study this slide. I'm just saying this is one particular thought pattern around that. I think there are a lot of others. How do you do this? How do you build serious games? I'm always asked that, like, what's the best way to do it? And I see lots of research where they're trying to finely tune what particular design to use or how you particularly make a cutscene work or do anything in a game. A lot of research is around these like sort of small design areas. This is how I do it. 5 T's, really simple. Good target, line-up theory behind it, pull in those subject matter experts and really understand how it actually works in the real world. Put together the best team and talent you can possibly find across all your disciplines. And then give them as much time as possible. And then test a lot. So what I'm telling you is that there is no magic formula. There is potentially a formulaic process that you can ascribe to. And you get into this notion of lots and lots of time on pre-production. Really decide what it is you're going to build and how it's going to be done. And stay on paper as long as you possibly can. This is a failure state of many serious games. Focus on your production with really talented individuals, and then think about how you connect your project back to everybody else. It's not enough to just put your game out there. It really is a product within a larger project, and connecting people back to the systems that will take them forward once the game gets them to that point is something that we're still quite failing at. So in summary, games can work. It's not easy. We need strong targets, and we need support for those targets. And we need bigger targets, I think. This is my new sort of feeling. Figuring out what your model is going to be is something that you're going to learn about in the next 2 days as you think about this. And really, that recipe for success in serious games is not only understanding why and what kinds of advantages we're trying to draw from them and how other people have done it before, and as much about game development. It really is about figuring out and honing the process by which your organization is going to do these things. The processes will get you. That's the common denominator between good games and bad games is always the process, not something very specific that they did. That always comes out of it. So that's what I came to tell you. Thank you. I don't think I have any more slides.
I think if there are a couple of questions.
I'm
in the
around, so.
audience? Otherwise, just yeah, ask a question. Otherwise, just tackle him.
I can tackle him, I guess. I was just curious about your idea of invading Canada and targets, because I've had cancer the past year and was playing a game at the time, an MMO called Warhammer.
Yep. Sure. I haven't played it, but I know it. Yeah.
And the best thing that's ever happened to me is a grassroots movement in Warhammer of Pink for Tink. Everyone dyed their armor pink. For me, Tinkerbell. And it became a whole breast cancer awareness thing for these young kids. And it became much bigger than me. For breast cancer in a PvP violent game that it's amazed me like what that game did for breast cancer awareness among young people. And so I've been trying to figure out, like, how do you do that? Like, it's not meant for that. That wasn't the...
Right. So in our taxonomies, we have a lot of examples of what you're talking about. There have been protests inside games, either against the game itself or in call of other things. There have been these like sort of fundraisers and other types of things. I think in the context of this room, it really falls into this notion of that some of these more socialized games have incredible opportunities in terms of bringing people together in a sort of public diplomacy-like manner and doing things. And they don't have to just happen in a very specialized space. They can actually happen in the games that we use and live in every day. It's all very, very interesting, and I think it speaks to the underlying general notion that all games are serious and that the connections that we make within them are often one of the most powerful things that we get. And so there are examples. I think I could give you more, and you could sort of build a slide stack and start looking at like what are the common denominators and how do they do it. And there's another guy, Joseph DeLapp, who does sort of protest things against war and other things inside some of these multiplayer games. So there are people working on it, actually.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
So I'd like to introduce our next panel, but before I do that, there's an announcement about the room change for the panels this afternoon, and I'm going to announce this again. But anything that is marked as happening in room 310 is actually happening in room 305. So you can take that down as a note. So our next panel is going to be on lessons learned in some of these serious games. The members of the panel are, first of all, Steve York, who's a multimedia and film producer, who's produced a string of very successful and highly acclaimed documentaries, including A Force More Powerful, which was later converted or transformed into a serious game that informs the thinking for people who are doing nonviolent protest. Asi Barak, who is the co-president of Games for Change and co-founded Impact Games, which created games including Peacemaker and Play the News. And Heather Chaplin, who is an assistant professor of journalism at the New School and the author of Smart Bomb, The Quest for Art, Entertainment, and Big Bucks in the Video Game Revolution. So with that, if our panelists can come up and have a seat.
Those are for the next
one. All right. All right, Steve.
Thank you. We have slides, and can I see what's up? Oh, there we go. All right, I'll try to keep track. People Power is a game which teaches the skills of civil resistance, kind of an academic term. In practice, in particular, the strategy of nonviolent action. Steve York, I'm the producer of this game, and I represent also the game's sponsor, the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and my own company, York Zimmerman, Inc. We should change the slide. I'm sorry. I don't know who's doing this. I don't have control over it. 6 years ago, we released an earlier game, A Force More Powerful, whose purpose was quite similar to the People Power game. Great. Thank you. Feedback from users of that game, many thousands, in fact, were what led us to produce the current game, People Power. By comparison, People Power is a lot easier to learn. When we brought out A Force More Powerful, one review was headlined, A Force More Complicated. It was a complicated game, and we've, I think, managed to make it a far less steep learning curve. It's easier to learn. It offers much more flexible scenario design. It has simpler language localization chores. It runs on PCs, Macs, and Linux, unlike the earlier game, which ran only on PCs. It's also downloadable, whereas A Force More Powerful is distributed solely on physical disks. The download for People Power is well under 50 megabytes, whereas the earlier game distributed on disk was the whole disk, 800 megabytes, I think. People Power is a turn-based, single-player strategy game. It ships with 4 scenarios, one of which involves an anti-corruption struggle, a second is a struggle for minority rights, a third is an occupation of a country, and the fourth is a fight against a dictatorship. So the scenarios are in effect defined by who the adversary is. The person playing the game is in charge of the movement, and the movement is a generic term for the nonviolent group that's trying to bring change. Generically, we call it the movement in every scenario, whereas the adversary in every scenario is called the regime. This home screen represents the headquarters of a nonviolent movement, and the player takes charge of that movement in a struggle against the adversaries. In addition, the game comes with a scenario builder tool, which allows the player to, at the maximum, create his or her own scenario from scratch. They can also modify the scenarios that come with the game, make them more difficult, or change the characteristics or the attributes of certain elements within the game. The idea of creating scenarios from scratch allows the possibility of building a scenario, for example, based on the situation in Zimbabwe, where you've got a pro-democracy movement fighting against Robert Mugabe. And you could put in the names of all the characters, all the political entities, all the civil society groups in Zimbabwe and play out the game based on those factors. You could also put in, create a scenario based on something that happened in the past. I mean, choose an element or a portion of the American Civil Rights Movement and play the game based on that with those characters in those places and so forth. The scenario builder, I don't know, it's going to be very hard to read this stuff. I'll just skip. Come back to the movement headquarters. Just to say a few words, gameplay is intended to teach values and processes. It's not intended to be a recipe book. I mean, you cannot, if you're an opposition movement or a resistance movement in a country like Zimbabwe that I just mentioned, or in Burma, for example, there are plenty of countries in the world where there are opposition political movements or resistance movements of various kinds who might learn something and find some benefits in playing this game. But it's not going to tell them how to go out and make a revolution. What it's going to do is teach them how to think about strategy by planning the way tactics, what tactics to use, when in the game, in what sequence, and so forth. I'm just going to skip through a few slides as I continue talking, rather than refer specifically to them. There is no single route to victory, and there are almost no fatal errors. It's possible to recover from bad decision and still win. It might take longer. It's also open-ended in the sense that you can choose your own victory condition. You may decide it's enough to compel the regime to permit free and fair elections. At the extreme, you might want to achieve the total defeat or collapse of the regime. The game requires the player to analyze the situation, analyze the characters, their attributes, and their positions on issues. And in simple terms, the goal is to attract as many characters as possible to join the movement, or the movement coalition, or to persuade groups such as political parties, labor unions, student associations, media organizations, to endorse or actively join in the work of the movement. Now, one key to this form of struggle is sequencing. You learn quickly that organizing mass protest or public actions in the streets is probably not the right thing to do at the beginning of your struggle. You should instead concentrate on building organization, on recruiting, training, fundraising, these kinds of things, to build up strength before you make yourself too visible in the streets, because regimes have a way of pretty much neutralizing any movement that simply puts 1 million people in the street before they're organized enough to actually achieve anything. I just probably should conclude by saying that I've just come back from a couple of weeks in Egypt. I was in Egypt 2 weeks, ending day before yesterday, and then 2 weeks in March, working on a new film about the revolution that occurred there early this year. What was interesting to me was, in the process of interviewing many of the people who were involved in ousting Hosni Mubarak, I discovered among the youth leaders that many of them had discovered our game, which has been available for download in open beta since last June, almost a year. We didn't push it. We depended on kind of word-of-mouth viral campaign, and many of them had found it. One particular guy with the April 6th movement that's been very much in the news because of their use of technology, in particular Facebook, had played the game quite a bit, and he said he found it very difficult, which didn't surprise me. We meant it to be difficult, and we meant it to be a kind of game that even if you don't win, in quotes, in the classical sense of winning, you still learn something. Even if you don't win, or you don't win decisively, you still learn something. But he said, you know, we lost the game, but fortunately we won the revolution. And I thought that was a perfectly nice situation to discover. I think whether he knows it or not, he probably did get something out of the game, but I'm not making any claims. The point is, I mean, the major complaint was that the game's not available in Arabic. It will be, by the way, probably within a month, because we've already started work on language localizations in Russian, Arabic, and Spanish. There will be more languages to come. But I think the situation in Egypt is a terrific example of, and I've just got a few pictures from things that happened. The April 6th movement, this picture is in their headquarters, is a perfectly good example of young people up to 30, 35 years of age who are very aware of the outside world and had managed to find on the internet and through other sources all kinds of reading material, manuals, guidebooks on how you go about running this kind of a revolution or this kind of a movement. And had been doing so for some years and had done a lot of things right. I think there's no question if you compare what they were doing in Egypt, and culminating in the famous 18 days starting the 25th of January in Tahrir Square in Cairo. What they were doing would have, first of all, it matches entirely the kinds of skills, the kinds of ideas, the kind of strategic thinking, the kinds of political analysis that this game is intended to teach, and I think does teach. And so I'm very encouraged that, that they actually found our material. And I'm just going to skip through these slides. And that's at the end of my slides. I think the most important thing for me to have done in my very brief time here is to describe the game in very simple terms, and hope to answer some of your questions.
Asi, we'll go to you, and then Heather, and then we'll do some questions.
I'll use the podium so you can look at the slides. So I'm here under two hats, and some of that you'll see in the next panel. I started a company, a for-profit company called Impact Games, out of Carnegie Mellon, and we took serious games or games for change for into the commercial space. And that's what I'm going to talk in this short segment. But I'm also now heading Games for Change, which is a non-profit. And it's a very different perspective. And a lot of the things that we'll discuss in lessons learned are things that I'm trying in Games for Change as a non-profit and kind of as a community platform to solve for other developers, other funders, other commissioners of games. In terms of Impact Games, the first product we launched that got some attention and is very related to the issues that the state is dealing with is Peacemaker. Peacemaker was a strategy game launched in 2007. We developed most of it in Carnegie Mellon, as I mentioned, with Israelis, Palestinians, and American experts. And the idea of Peacemaker is that you actually can make peace at the end of the game. That was the winning solution between, you could make peace between Israel and Palestine. And even more than that, you could play both perspectives. So you could actually switch during the game or after you played one perspective and play the Israeli leader versus the Palestinian leader. And they're very different games. It's asymmetric. One is very powerful and one is actually under occupation. And to even show that to an Israeli perspective or American perspective was very important. What I want to show you is a very short video, and we'll talk after that.
Peacemaker is a game in which you take the role of one of the leaders. You can take either the role of the Israeli Prime Minister or the Palestinian President. You can play both perspectives. And the idea is that as the leader, you have to react to real-time events happening in the world. You can negotiate with other leaders, but you also have security or military actions that you can take. And by doing so, you have to reach a peaceful solution while in office.
In an Israeli high school, a new computer game called Peacemaker was launched today. Children playing the role of Israeli and Palestinian leaders trying to make peace in a virtual world of suicide bombings and Israeli military strikes.
We don't expect to address all issues of the conflict. We don't expect to give all the answers. We're bringing up issues for discussion.
I think the best aspect of playing this game is that, especially if you're Palestinian student in the territories or an Israeli student within Israel, you get a chance to really feel what both sides are thinking and get a better sense of what they can do together to work towards peace.
If you look at the video game industry today, there are so many games out there about violence, about war, about destructions. We say a simple thing: there is certainly a place for one little game about peace.
And the reason I show this video is, and that's kind of a commentary on the whole day or the 2 days that you're going to explore. We talk a lot about the theory and we dissect a lot how to make serious games, and I think it's very important. But there's something to be said about the passion. And the fact that a group of students come with an idea and go all the way, and also about the audience. The reason I wanted you to feel a bit the media coverage and the people that play and what they say about the game. Again, those are very important things. We're talking about an experience, and we're not only developing a back-end tool or a programming tool. We're actually making a game that we want people to get through the head, but also through the heart. And get something that is beyond just understanding and instructions, get something that actually change something in their perspective. After that, and I'll go over that very quickly, we made a product called Played and Used, and that was a direct consequence of Peacemaker. The idea was, okay, Peacemaker was perceived very well, but it was limited. It was only around the conflict in the Middle East, and it wasn't updated. Played and Used was a social gaming platform, one of the early ones, and the whole idea was how do we update news as they come? And now we let people almost in a day respond to world events and predict the results and come back, just like in Fantasy League, to see how they equal to other players. The last thing I think is the most important one is my takeaways. I'll do it kind of give you the 4 or 5 things that I think were most important to us as a lesson, and we can then talk about it with the other members of the panel. One thing that we didn't have is a publisher, and I think that this is one of the main gaps in our space. The idea that in every other industry, even in books and films, and definitely in the commercial game space, you can go to someone that will take care of your marketing and distribution. In our case, there was no one like that, and you need to do it yourself. And it's very demanding because beyond creative, beyond the design, you need to take care of all those things. The other one is that creativity is not only about the design and gameplay. So one thing we did was a very creative distribution deal with an NGO in Israel. And that NGO bought 100,000 copies of the game. And that was probably the biggest moment that we had. And it's very untraditional. And they took the 100,000 games, 80,000 they gave free in a newspaper for subscribers, and 20,000 they use in workshops until this day. And it has a life of its own. They keep on going, they're funding themselves. And again, that's creative distribution and something we didn't plan for at the beginning. The idea of context. It's very important to think who you design for. We did it in the design phase of Peacemaker, but we kind of neglected it later on. And we worked with teachers, but when we went into the market, we didn't prepare the materials, we didn't prepare the marketing and distribution for that audience. And this is very important. Do you design it to someone to find it by their own? Do you design it for a platform that people will virally spread it? Or do you design it for a moderated environment and expect teachers to work with it or other community centers? And the last one is impact and evaluation. As a for-profit company, we didn't do any of that. I mean, we definitely aimed at impact, but we didn't evaluate it. The more I'm in this space, and especially in the Games for Change context, I think that evaluation is key. It's costly, but it's super important because it ties your impact objectives and conclude in a way that you can go on and scale it and convince other people that you have real results. So these are kind of my lessons learned, and thank you very much for coming and listening. Thanks.
All right. Heather. I don't have any slides, so I don't need it. My name's Heather Chaplin. Unlike Steve and Asi, I'm not a game maker. I'm a journalist, and I've been covering games since about 2001. So my perspective is very much that of an observer. And the thing that has kept me in the game space all these years is I've really lost pretty much all interest in the commercial mainstream game space, but the work that's going on in indie games and serious games seems really meaningful and really important to me, so I've sort of stuck around covering that. And I actually thought, since we only have a few minutes each to talk, and Steve and Asi both, have the experience and knowledge of actually putting out a game, I thought that I would share some of the things, some of the lessons over the last few years from a more sort of theoretical perspective, in the sense of, what is a game, and and sort of what some of the thinking is about that from some of the really great game theorists out there who, I hear talk at Games for Change and places like that. So I hope that's useful. It's sort of ironic. I usually feel like as a journalist, I'm the guy saying, stop being so theoretical. What do you actually mean? So bear with me. But I think one of the key things that's been learned over the last handful of years is we've started to get a really deep understanding of what a game is and how it's different than other forms of media. And I think this is important. I mean, certainly in the journalism space, one of the things that we're thinking about now with every story is what's the best way to tell my story. It might be a written 1,200-word piece, or it might be a digital application, or it might be infographics, or it might be data visualization. So I think it's the same thing. Games are not the answer to everything, but there are some things that games are really great for. And probably the sort of key nugget that I feel like has emerged is this idea that games are a complex, dynamic system. And when I say that, I don't mean complex as the opposite of simple, but rather complex meaning the level of interconnectedness. So, for example, when a person is actually playing a video game, they're engaging with the processes of the system itself. So what's an example of a complex dynamic system in the real world? A really easy, great example is global warming, right? We run our cars here I live in New York or here in DC. The exhaust affects, the polar bear's habitat, or the coal plants in China affect the air in Europe. So you start to see that when you have a complex dynamic system, every component, every variable affects every other variable. And so it's important to not just look at a certain aspect, but to look at the relationship between the different aspects and the way that the different variables affect one another. And games are little models of complex dynamic systems. So when you give somebody a game to play, they're actually playing with how that system works. So one of the big lessons we've learned in the last few years is this idea that games are really great for fostering systems thinking. And the reason I would say this is so important is sort of twofold. One, as we live in an increasingly globalized world where the level of interconnection between people, between economies, between states gets more and more heightened, it becomes more and more important that people start to be able to think systemically, not just linearly. So games can be really powerful for fostering that. And the other thing is that we increasingly live in a world of artificial intelligence systems, right? Everything from the way we bank to the way we make friends online to almost every aspect of our life is increasingly dominated by artificial intelligence systems, and that are we going to have the literacy to be able to really understand these systems that are playing such an important role in our life? Which leads me to the next point I want to make, which is one of the other great points that's come out. There's been a lot of work done recently about play, because when you're engaging with a game, you are playing. And play is how primates learn, right? All animals, from dogs to humans to whales to gorillas, we all play. That's how we learn. And there's a lot of interesting work being done about rethinking of play not as sort of an infantile pursuit, but as something that's very important for people to do, even as grown-ups, as a way to learn. There's also a lot of thinking about that the best way to understand a system and to deal with the system is to play with it, because play is the human interaction with a set of rules. So there's also some thinking out there that there's something, I don't know if subversive is too strong a word, but I kind of like it, something sort of subversive about play, because play is when people push back against rules. And so I think there's something really interesting there to be thinking about, that when you give somebody a game, they're going to be engaging in play, which is being in an experimental mindset, being in an open mindset, being able to learn, and thinking in the sense of what can I do? What can I do with these rules? What happens if I push back? Which I also think in contemporary life is probably an important thing for people to be able to do. And then just the last point that I wanted to make was there was a talk at Games for Change a couple years ago by a guy named Frank Lance, who's a really important game thinker. He runs the NYU Game Center. And he made this point that's just stuck with me. I don't necessarily have anything incredibly concrete to say about it, but I want to throw it out there, which was, there's a lot of talk about games as another media, another way of transmitting information. And he put out there that this is the wrong way to think about games, and that games actually create a space, whether it's physical or virtual, which allows for emergent behavior, right? So that, like for the example that the woman gave of what happened with people turning their shields pink, nobody can ever anticipate what's going to happen in a game, right? Because you have people playing against the rule set. So all kinds of emergent behavior happens. And I think that there's something that's an idea that's really worth thinking about, that has a lot of potential, because when you have emergence, you start to have the potential for creative problem solving. So I wonder about the potential of games in terms of new solutions kind of coming out that nobody, including the game designer, could have expected. So I think I'll leave it there, and then if that wasn't clear or too theoretical, I'm happy to talk more on it.
Before we open it up to the audience for questions, one question, I guess, for Steve and Asi, what is the hardest lesson that you think you had to learn in your creation and distribution of these games? And obviously you covered a few points, but what do you think is the most common pitfall or stumbling block that someone who wants to go into this, serious games for change type project, the obvious thing that they would think of to do, which turns out to be completely wrong?
I had no idea that I would be answering this question, but I will respond gut level, just quick, from the gut. It is the notion that you have to, the idea of making a game for people who've never made a game before, which we hadn't. I'm a filmmaker. We discovered that there's a tremendous kind of vacuum out there for people who want to learn how to wage these kinds of struggles. There's almost nothing there other than some fairly dense, 100, 300, 500-page long books. And the idea is that since we knew nothing about making a game, we should just hire a game production company, a game developer, which we did. It's kind of everything under one roof. Designers, programmers, artists, music people, QA department, all of that. They did the best they could. But the second time around, first of all, we had a lot of experience showing that first game. One day, I was not present at this particular encounter, but one of my colleagues, Ivan Marovic, who was part of the youth movement that defeated Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia and is a brilliant sort of political strategist and a game fanatic, he was showing the game, I think, at PopTech a few years ago, and he happened to run into Will Wright, who's a very famous guy associated with The Sims and creator of The Sims. And Will looked at it and said, well, it's kind of interesting, but let me just give you an idea. And so Will said to Ivan, here's a slogan. You need a game which has very simple rules, and now I'm coming back to what Heather just said. You have a system that has certain rules, and you play within those rules. You need a game which involves very simple rules which lead to complex situations. That became, along with one other, and I'll tell you that in a second, a touchstone, a slogan for production of our second game. And the second was that we're developing a game for people who don't play games. And there's a huge audience of gamers who buy these first-person shooters and games like Grand Theft Auto, about whom there are certain assumptions, what they're looking for, what kinds of conventions need to be built into the game, and so forth. That's not our target. We realized from the beginning, and I think it's been borne out, that our game is aimed at people who've never played a computer game, a video game in their lives, and probably will never play another one. They're interested in this because of the circumstances of their lives, and probably not interested in gaming as such. So a game for people who don't play games. And with that in mind, we ended up producing the second game on an a la carte basis, where we hired a freelance game designer as an individual, not part of a company. And then all the other pieces, an AI and artificial intelligence consultant who was completely unconnected with anybody, just dealt with artificial intelligence. Eventually, a software development company that had never done a game before, but they happened to have great skills in producing what's called productivity software, which is aimed at people who are not highly computer literate but need to get into something easily and quickly. So we essentially became, the analogy is if you're going to build a house, you normally hire a contractor who hires an electrical contractor and a structural engineer and all these. We became the general contractor and hired all the pieces individually. A lot more work for us, but I think it was a very important lesson that paid off.
Yes, so we are, as you can imagine, approached by many individuals and organizations that want to go into the space. So yesterday I got an email from the Scottish government. 2 days ago it was a filmmaker that wants to extend his property into gaming. 3 days ago it was a non-profit. It's very diverse. I would say, though, that the most common mistake, or the thing that I think leads to failure, is that instead of going through a process that you would go with any product, if you wanted to make a documentary, people jump into the creative. So most of those conversations are like, well, I have this idea, it's really cool, I want to make this game, it's going to look like this and that. And then the question to me is, okay, so what do you think is the time and the budget? And I need to put it in the proposal. And what we usually do is do the pause. And we usually say, let's go back a few steps. And the most important things that we usually highlight before we even get to creative and solutions is to say, who's your audience? But let's define it very clearly. And let's not define only an age group. Let's also think about the psychology of that audience and their gaming ability and which region they are in. And let's try to define it. It can be very narrow, it can be very broad, like Ben said, but let's understand that audience. The second one is the context that I mentioned. Where your game is going to be played. Is it going to be played at home? Is it going to be played in the classroom, in a community center? Audience and context together will give you a very good idea of who you're aiming it for. And the last one, which is to me the most important one, is your learning and impact objectives. Sometimes they go together, sometimes they're separate. But what are the 2-3 takeaways you want people to get from your game? When they finish playing it, whether it's one session, whether it's 3 months, what do you want them to say? What do you want them to do? It could be really that you're aiming for direct action, that you actually want them to donate money or to go somewhere, but it could be that you're only interested in skills and knowledge. Again, should be very defined. And I think that once people, or those people that want to go into the space and make games for the first time, answer those questions, then it's much easier to say, okay, this is a creative solution, this is a platform we want to choose, this is the budget, this is how we're going to market it. But before you have those questions, it's very, very hard to jump into, this is my creative, cool idea.
And just to synthesize between you, and this echoes as well what Arjun said in his presentation, is that there's a fair amount of thought and research that goes on before the sort of creative vision is put together. In advertising would be called account planning. Who are these people? What do they do? What's the installed base? All of the contextual information around what your target player population may be, so that there might be an idea that you think is amazing, and it is amazing if you were deploying it in country A, but a lot of the basic mechanisms to play that game don't necessarily exist in country B, right? So this goes to, is it online game versus social network versus mobile. There are all sorts of research that needs to be done in advance. And the other, to echo Asi, is the objective and having a really clear idea of what you want to accomplish. In my own interactions at the border between games and government, oftentimes there's this kind of enthusiasm about the trend, let's do something on Twitter, social networking, it's hot, we've got to do something there, or hey, let's do a game because that's fun. And it's often either technology driven or it's driven by either the desire to be current or fear of not being current. But it's not necessarily informed by the context or any particular objective. And the more work that gets done in that upfront phase, the more likely you are to be successful in your project.
If I may just underline something that Ben Sawyer said before we arrived here on the stage, which is stay on paper as long as possible. I'm being very specific now about a process that needs to be much more strategic and complicated. But deciding who your audience is, that was easy for us. My associates at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict have been involved in trying to disseminate information about how you wage a struggle in a nonviolent way for years and years and years, and we're associated. So we know more or less what that audience is, and so we didn't have to spend a lot of time thinking about it. We did have to consider what kind of technology is installed. We talk about installed base in the countries that we're likely to see our game used. And so among other things, that meant that on People Power, we did not want to adopt the 3D visual interface. It's just much too hardware intensive and was going to be a problem. It also meant that the size of the game would be huge. But going back to what Ben said about staying on paper, there's enormous virtue in that advice. Write design documents, elaborate them through many iterations before you actually begin programming or thinking about art or creative. It will pay off in the long run because you can't make creative decisions until you have the answers to these other specifications. Who is my audience? What country are they located in? What do you want them to do? Having played the game, all of those things have to be very, very well refined before you can make creative decisions.
One last question before we go to the audience. In terms of the nuts and bolts, budgets and timelines, what would you offer in terms of lessons learned about, defining the budget around a serious game and defining a timeline around a serious game, and where you're most likely to go wrong in your projections about those numbers?
I mean, at the end of the day, going with our previous answers, I think that it's a result of many previous decisions that you're making. One big challenge with gaming, unlike, again, traditional media, is that technology is a big mess, is a big unknown. And you can design a game from, I would say, 50,000 and less, especially on mobile platforms, to 5 million and more. And that ecosystem, that complexity is daunting. And many people look at it and look at the variety of platforms and just lose their way. And I think that by answering those things that I said before, and Steve mentioned, the idea of really understanding the audience, the context, and what you're trying to achieve, it's much easier to start narrowing it down and say, okay, actually for what I'm trying to do, mobile makes more sense than anything else because the audience has access to it, etc. Then you start to look at in the metrics of budget and timeline. You're starting to look at something much more tangible, and those answers are there. I mean, I could now, if I hear someone come to me and say, well, I want to do a mobile game, it has to be launched next year, and it has to be that and that, it's pretty easy to say, okay, roughly this is your time and budget. But again, until you have that very narrow definition of the platform, it will be very tough to get those answers.
All right, are there any questions in the audience? Over here.
Could you explore, all of you, the space of tension between the objective of a game, the peace process, or teaching people how to do nonviolent, civil, whatever, and the space for emergent behavior that you've talked about? Because it seems like there's a line there between over-scripting and under-scripting, but also how do games accommodate the kind of instructional games or social behavior change games? How do they accommodate emergent behavior that the developers didn't anticipate?
So the question for whoever may be viewing in video is, what's the tension between the objective of the game and the rules that you're building into it, and the space for emergent behavior, and the balance between under-scripting and over-scripting? Steve, you want to?
Well, the quick answer is you want to avoid, or resist is the better word. You want to resist putting up barriers to the maximum extent possible. You want, in fact, unpredictability. You want people to be given a chance to fail, to make mistakes. We're talking about serious games here, for which you could also say we're talking about educational games, games intended to teach something. But there are different kinds of teaching. I mean, to say something really pathetically obvious. I mean, there are different kinds of learning. There's the kind of learning that comes from reading a textbook and committing a lot of things to memory, and taking exams, learning that tends to be associated with lecture-style academic courses and so forth. And then there are many other kinds of learning, but the kind we're talking about here happens to be what's generally known as experiential learning. Providing people with an experience, letting them have an experience from which they learn something. And I think quite often there's more to be learned by making mistakes than by doing things in a kind of way that's been taught as the right way to do things. There's more than one route to go. But I think the key is experiential learning, and the idea that, and so getting there, my first answer, and I'm not a game designer, getting there involves creating a system, building a model. I mean, that's the first phase of our work in both of these game projects, is building a model, creating a kind of system of systems which has no flesh on it at all. There are no characters, there are no groups, there are no graphics. It's a kind of thing that can be played on a spreadsheet, in fact. You build a model in which, when fear increases, hostility probably does as well, or when momentum decreases, something else happens, and probably a range of things. But anyway, you build this model, and it tends to be very mathematical. I mean, it begins with ideas, begins with human psychology and the basis of human behavior and the kinds of things that people do when they're under certain kinds of pressure, or the beneficiaries of certain rewards. But that's all eventually turned into mathematical equations.
And I think it's useful to note here that the mathematical definition of a game, right, which is it has rules, it has a goal, and it has a disequilibrial outcome. And I think, to Steve's point, modeling is very important and perhaps undervalued by people who are doing games for the first time. And a lot of the complexity that we're talking about has to do with the robustness and the extensibility of that underlying model. So, to the keep it on paper as long as possible, or keep it in a spreadsheet as long as possible point, sometimes the soul of a game, and particularly a simulation type game, the soul of that type of game is the model. And so you can spend a lot of time, and perhaps maybe that's the expertise that you need to bring in first, right? Is someone who can turn the model that you have, because of your subject matter expertise, into the math that's necessary to drive that, and say, okay, well, yeah, but we want to adjust that parameter a little bit. How do you do that? So modeling is very important. And then again, as you did in your game, think really carefully about how you make it possible for end users to adjust or extend that experience, in their own situation. So on the basic level, it's just changing around the names of things and making more of the things and text descriptions of the things. If you take it all the way out, you might want to open source your software to the point where people could actually start building an ecosystem around that model itself, or alternate models. And obviously, it depends what your business model is. But I think there's a huge opportunity in this serious games space, the space where people are not necessarily in it to become billionaires, to create a really exciting open source software community around these models and around the games that put the meat on those bones.
Let me just put a bottom line from my perspective. When all is said and done, there is almost no way to know what kinds of results are going to come from following a certain sequence of tactics in this game. And the only way to find out is testing. Testing. Even at the level, even at the early spreadsheet stage, you can try things and see, I can't get where I want to go. There's something wrong here. We have to open up something here. Or whatever. There are just any number of possibilities that can only be discovered by testing, by playing this thing, doing unexpected things, running the same tactic 10 times in a row and seeing, or doing nothing, just advancing turns. And let the artificial intelligence do what it's supposed to be doing, turn by turn. But the player herself is doing nothing. And you find out amazing things that you better go back and fix. Yeah.
And then also, just to quantify it a little bit, it's useful to spell out for yourself how many different kinds of things that can the player make decisions about, right, and how many of those things interact with each other. Right? And the higher those numbers are, the more unpredictable your game is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I'm not a game designer, but I've interviewed a ton of game designers. And I think that both what Steve and JC were saying is very relevant, and sort of what I feel like, and I hope this isn't a lame answer, but that what the game designers that I've talked to about this will say is that the emergent behavior, it's almost like the magic of a game, that if you create a robust system, and balance is something game designers talk about a lot. So if you have, and again, the Will Wright idea of that a very small set of rules can create incredibly complex behavior, that when you create a rule set and you have a win state, and then you kind of set people free to play, it's almost impossible to avoid unexpected outcomes. Will Wright is someone I spent a lot of time interviewing, and he had the most amazing stories about what happened in The Sims, just things that he just never could have imagined, and how that was the funnest part of being a game designer. For example, he was telling me a story about talking to kids who, when they first played The Sims, the first thing they tried to do was kill their Sims. And everybody was like, oh, this is so horrible, this is so horrible. And Will said that that's exactly what should be happening, right? Because they're playing, they're pushing against the boundaries of the rules. When people are in a game, I always think game players are sort of little embodiments of, the scientific method, right? They're testing. What happens if I do X? Yep. What happens if I do Y? And that mindset that players get into is one of the most interesting things to me about games, if that's helpful at all.
I think this side of the room has been ignored. So let's have a question here.
So I wanted to continue on the modeling thread by raising something that Ben Sawyer said earlier, which is, with a game, the point is not necessarily complete fidelity, but especially when it comes to serious games in the environment and diplomacy space, one of the things that I worry about is building trust and the relationship between that and transparency. So we can look in the environmental space and see climate modelers all over the world. They update their climate models, they produce a journal article, they test model against measurements, and then they have 100 references in their article, and they're still guaranteed to get beat up in the media, at least these days. Now, when I'm playing a serious game, the first thing I'm going to ask about emergent behavior is, when something emerges that nobody expected, can I trust what it is? And so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the relationship between games and models and transparency and for what some people in the simulation community would call verification and validation. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, maybe I'll start on that, and that's I think it's really related to the last question. So one myth to break is that no game is really a complete sandbox. So, you know, even when people talk about Will Wright and his genius design and how much The Sims and SimCity are those environments that you can do whatever you like, at the end of the day, there are many, many small and large design decisions that Will Wright took on making sure how that system behaves. And I think that at the heart of every game, if it's a peace simulation or a people power game or an environment model, there are those decisions that at the end of the day will affect even the emergent behavior. And those rules, you talked about those rules of the system, they can be defined, they can be tweaked based on testing, and you can make sure that at the end of the day, in terms of transparency, accuracy, you're on topic. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that the audience is also very important here, and to talk about also related to the testing idea. So as much as we say stay on paper, I would also say test on paper. So in a sense, even before you code one line, there are many things that you can test with your audience. And for us, in terms of that decision on how much sandbox Peacemaker, for example, should be, came from the audience, because we wanted to leave it much more open than our Palestinian audience wanted it to be. And they came back to us when we made it without any winning conditions and with things like invade Canada or nuke the other side. And they came back to us and say, no, guys, we want a two-state solution at the end. We want an independent state at the end of the Palestinian game we play. So this is another thing to say about the testing and the idea that a lot of the things you can in a very early stage, rather than develop the full product and give it to your audience, hear from them already in the design stage.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and something that I often like to say when talking about games. And there's a woman named Mary Flanagan, who's a game designer, who talks about this a lot, which is that there are always values built into a system. So we like to think like it's a system, it's a simulation, it is objective, it has no bias, but there's always the person who created. And since Will Wright keeps coming up, you know, in SimCity, if you raise taxes, you get urban unrest. So that's an assumption, right? That's a bias. So if you find yourself getting into this space and exploring simulations and games, I think it's really an important thing to keep in mind, which is what biases am I putting in here? And then just the other quick point I want to make, since the issue of climate change simulations came up, is there are so many people creating simulations, the government, you know, wargaming, climate simulations, that I think there's a big opportunity in the serious game world to take these simulations and build a game layer over it. So for example, when a climate change organization builds a simulation of what they think will happen in 10 years, is the right thing to do with that information to write an article in a journal, or is the right solution to turn that simulation into a game and let people play with it and have the experience of what will happen themselves? Maybe that's an even better learning opportunity.
Or even a discourse about the simulation itself, because as you said, all simulations have biases. In SimCity, it's impossible to build a thriving city without investing a lot of money in public transportation. Mm-hmm. That's something that Will Wright believes, you know, and obviously we've seen a lot of back and forth about models in you know, of climate change, And, you know, every time there's a presidential election, both political parties come up with a budget simulation that you can play. And you can only win those simulations if you do certain things that are consistent with either party's beliefs about how you balance a budget and build a thriving economy. And so, to your point about trust, I think if there's an area where the model is in any way contentious, that you have to be very transparent about what the model actually is, so that if people want to argue with the result, they can say, well, you did this because your model does that, but I think something else. And if you change this about your model, well, the outcome would change here. And that process is, even for the people who disagree with you, that the transparency associated with that builds trust, because you're willing to make your assumptions explicit rather than having this black box that, you know, comes out with a result when you play a certain way and not other ways.
If it's not already clear, at the risk of saying something terribly simple, but simulations and games are not synonymous. A simulation is one thing and a game is another thing. A simulation is often used by scientists, be they social scientists or physicists or whatever, to study something, a system, let's say. Games, at least the way we approach games, I won't make any claims for others, are meant to teach something, not to study it.
Well, a game also has a goal. You know,
precisely,
so,
yeah. But simulations approach reality, in fact, whereas games choose to model only a very limited number of variables, hopefully sufficient to the purpose at hand, but not more. And a simulation often will have far, far more variables, and it can be quite boring to play because it's not a game. It's not fun. It wasn't designed to be fun. It was meant to achieve some scientific or academic purpose. Anyway, we've certainly resisted. I mean, you hear people refer to, in fact, I've heard people refer to our game as a simulation game, which is almost an oxymoron in my book. And I try to resist it and explain. I'm not prickly about it, but there is a difference, huge difference.
So we're out of time before coffee, but everyone is here, and people with questions, feel free to sort of come up and ask them. We're going to have a coffee break. It starts now, and our next panel is at 11 o'clock.